Okay, hello folks. Welcome to another week of offsite learning. We're moving into our last unit now, okay, which is biology. So there are new notes up on the Google Classroom or in the agenda. I'm going to do it a bit different for this last week. I'm not going to post the entire biology unit notes. I'll just kind of go week by week. I'll post 1 week's worth of the notes at the time, and then we'll just pick up where we left off on the next week, and I'll post those amount of notes. So the entire biology booklet is in the Google Classroom, but what you need for this week is, okay? So let's start our last unit, biology. So starting things off with our big ideas for topic 1, okay, like always, these are the concepts that at the end of this video lesson, you really should be able to pull out and answer, right? So be on the lookout for these. What are abiotic factors? What are biotic factors? What is an organism, a population, community, ecosystem, and biosphere? What does it mean for an ecosystem to be in equilibrium? How can the success, quote unquote, of an ecosystem be measured? And what is biodiversity? Okay, so starting out on page 1 of our biology notes, we're going to start out with a definition, and then I'm actually going to go to a PowerPoint for a little bit here, but you would probably want to follow along on this page here and copy down some of the definitions and examples as we go, okay? But first, let's just get this out of the way, the biosphere. A sphere is basically just a space where things can exist, right? Like a sphere-shaped space, okay? Bio, what does bio mean? Life, right? So the biosphere is anywhere on Earth where you can find life. Okay, anywhere on Earth where you can find life is part of the biosphere. So you're in the biosphere right now because you're alive, right? So by default, you have to be. And the biosphere is kind of split up into 3 places. It's basically land, air, and water. We know the lithosphere from geology. The lithosphere is all land, right? Litho means land. Hydro, if you're dehydrated, what do you need? Water, right? That hydro means water. So the hydrosphere is all water on Earth. And can you find life in water? Yeah, right? There's tons of life in the water. So it's part of the biosphere as well. The atmosphere, atmo means gases and air basically, right? So all the gases surrounding the Earth. Can you find life up there? Yep, you sure can, right? There's life all throughout the atmosphere. So together, so all 3 of those are parts of the biosphere because you can find life at all 3 of those places. Now, would the inner parts of the Earth be part of the biosphere? Like, would the core be part of the biosphere? Well, no, right? There's no life down there. So it is not part of the biosphere. So I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint now. As I'm going through it, okay, see if you can jot down some of the definitions on this page in your notes of these types of things. These are how we organize the biosphere. We're also going to talk a little bit about abiotic and biotic factors. So when I post the completed notes, I'll fill these out, but just see if you can get the information as we go through the PowerPoint here. So I'll start out with the idea of what is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is just any place on Earth where living things interact with other living things and with non-living things. So they need to interact with each other and also with stuff that isn't alive. Once that's happening, you're talking about an ecosystem. Okay, so this very much so an ecosystem, right? It's easy to definitely say, yep, it's an ecosystem. Why? Well, look at all these living things interacting with each other and also with non-living stuff, right? They're interacting with the water, which is non-living. They're drinking, right? Definitely an ecosystem. Okay. What about this? Just one tree. Well, remember, what's an ecosystem? Living things interacting with each other. So we have here fungus, that's living, right? Plants, those are living. And the tree, the wood there, is dead, so it's non-living, right? So we have living things interacting with non-living things, an ecosystem. What about this guy? Is that an ecosystem? Well, technically, yeah, right? In your digestive system, you have trillions of little bacteria, which bacteria is living, okay? Helping you digest your food. So that's you, a living thing, trillions of bacteria, and the nutrients in your food. That's non-living. Those are all interacting. So you, in a way, are your very own ecosystem. Yes, you're part of other ecosystems, but you are also are an ecosystem all by yourself. So like we said, in an ecosystem, you have living things interacting with each other and also with non-living things, right? So we call the living things biotic factors. There's that word, bio, life, right? So biotic factors are living. They are actually alive. Things like grass, right? Plants are living. A mouse is obviously an animal that is living, right? These are all examples of biotic factors. Now, abiotic, usually when you put that A at the beginning of something, right? Like if you are asymptomatic, it means you don't have symptoms, or asexual reproduction, that is producing without sex, right? So abiotic means not living, right? Biotic means living. If you put an A on it, you're saying not living factors. So water, non-living, right? But it is definitely part of the interactions in the ecosystem. Very important. All living things need it, okay? Soil conditions could be an abiotic factor. Sunlight is an abiotic factor, right? Why do we use that word factor? Because they are factors in the ecosystem. They have a impact, right? If something is a big factor in your life, it means it has an impact on your life. These things all have a role and an impact on the ecosystems they're part of. So they are factors. Okay, so abiotic essentially means a non-living thing. Biotic means a living thing in an ecosystem. And they're factors because they have an impact on that ecosystem. Now let's get down to how we organize living things. So this is essentially how do we organize the biosphere? So the smallest level is an organism. An organism is just any single living thing. So you are an organism, your dog is an organism, your cat is an organism, one bacteria is an organism, one tree is an organism. Now, this one isn't really a level of organization. It's just a way of classifying different organisms. So you probably know kind of what a species is, right? Humans are a species. Dogs are a species. But where do we kind of draw our lines? How do we decide what belongs to the same species and what doesn't? If you are part of the same species, there's kind of two things you have to do. You have to be able to have babies. You have to be able to reproduce. Okay, so if you can reproduce with something, that's one criteria to be the same species. But then your babies also have to be able to have babies. So one example is a mule. Okay, so a mule is actually the baby of a horse and a donkey. Now, horses and donkeys are not the same species. Why? Well, they can have a baby, right? They can have a mule. However, mules cannot have their own babies. They are infertile. So that means donkeys and horses still are two different species. They can have babies, but their babies can't have babies. So they are still two different species. Of course, most different species can't even do that first step, right? Okay. So just an example of what is a species, right? Bengal tigers. Okay. And there we have the Latin names Homo sapiens for humans, right? And dogs. So some species can look very different, but all dogs, all common dogs are able to reproduce and have those babies also be able to reproduce. So even though a golden retriever and a wiener dog look nothing alike, still the same species because they can have a baby and that baby can have babies. However, dogs and wolves are not the same species because a dog and a wolf can't even have a baby. Okay, back to organizing now the biosphere. The next kind of level we have is a population. So if you have a group of one species living within an ecosystem, that's the population, okay? And it's kind of relative. You can kind of say, what's the population of ravens in Birchwood Trails? And then you could make your area bigger and say, what's the population of ravens in Fort McMurray? And then you can make it bigger and say, what's the population of ravens in Alberta, right? But it's always just one species, and you look at how many organisms are there in an ecosystem. Just like we use population when we talk about a city, right? The population of Fort McMurray is talking about people. We don't include our dogs in the population of Fort McMurray. Okay, now take those populations and have them interact with each other, and you've got a community. Ravens are interacting with the humans and the worms and the bears and the bacteria. Well, now you've got a community. Multiple populations interacting together in an ecosystem. You might be starting to say to yourself, isn't that just the same thing as an ecosystem? Remember, what did we say an ecosystem is? Living things and non-living things interacting. So what's missing here? Right, the non-living things. So a community is essentially an ecosystem, but take out the abiotic factors, the non-living things. So here's kind of a picture showing, right? We have an organism, just a single fish. An organism is one single fish. A population could be all of those fish in this one pond. Community, I don't really like this picture for community because they got water and soil. So this is really kind of an ecosystem, right? Because it's not just living things interacting here. It's actually non-living things as well. So that's really more of an ecosystem. This one's definitely an ecosystem though now because you can see for sure the non-living things are there. The sunlight is in there. And the biosphere, well, the inside of the earth is not part of the biosphere, right? But anywhere that life can be found, part of the biosphere. This is a good one too. I like this one a bit better because it doesn't actually show you any non-living things, although I'm sure there's soil underneath that grass, right? So we go from organism, one antelope, population. Notice how it's all antelopes. If you ignore the grass shouldn't be there, right? Community, now we have multiple organisms, including the trees and the grass and all that. That's a community, living things interacting. And then once we bring non-living things like sunlight and soil and water into it, now we're actually talking about an ecosystem, okay? Take all the ecosystems on Earth and you have the biosphere. Okay, so hopefully you were able to get those definitions. If not, you can kind of pause the video now and go through them. Let's come up with some examples together. Or better yet, I would say pause the video, see if you can come up with your own examples of these things, and then come back and we'll see what other ones I came up with, okay? And then you can compare. So I'd say do that. Pause the video, come up with your own examples of all of this stuff. Okay, so for an example of an organism, well, we could pick anything. How about a moose? So an organism would just be one single moose, right? So example, one moose. Now, for a population, we have to kind of specify where, right? For example, the population of Fort McMurray is about 90,000, but that population of Fort McMurray, if we zoom out, we could also say we're part of the population of Alberta. And if we zoom out further, we could say we're part of the population of Canada. Further, we could even say the world, right? So when we say a population, we need to specify where. So let's say all the moose in Banff National Park. How about that? Now, how do we get to a community? Well, remember, community is just all the living stuff interacting with each other. That's what makes a community, all living things interacting. So let's just say, simple enough, all living things in Banff National Park. Okay, how do we take it to the next level and make it an ecosystem? Well, remember, community is just an ecosystem minus the non-living stuff. So we just got to put the non-living stuff in and then it's an ecosystem. Okay, so all living and non-living things. Biosphere, coming up with an example for that is kind of weird because there's only one, right? It's the biosphere. There is only one, right? I suppose you could say on other planets there might be, but we don't know about those. The only one we know about is our biosphere, which is just, again, if you add up all the ecosystems on Earth, you have the biosphere. Okay, so just a quick kind of summary here of the idea of abiotic versus biotic, right? Abiotic means not alive, biotic means alive. So some things that are considered abiotic factors are climate, right? That's going to have an effect on what kinds of things can live there. If there's never any rain, right, you're not going to have a lot of plant life, which is going to affect what kinds of other organisms can eat there that would normally eat those plants, of course, right? Nutrient availability, water availability, all this stuff, soil acidity, temperatures, right? Okay. Biotic factors, everything that's living. Those are also going to have an impact on what's in this area, right? Right? If, for example, if there's no flowers there, you're not going to have many bees there, right? Because bees rely on flowers and flowers rely on bees. So they have an impact on what grows there. Okay. So just some practice with this idea of abiotic and biotic. Okay. Just state whether these are biotic or abiotic factors and what their significance in an ecosystem might be. So sunlight exposure. Is sunlight alive or not? It's not, right? So this would be an abiotic factor, okay? A parasitic bacteria population. Now, bacteria is alive. It's living. It's a little one-celled organism, okay? So this is a biotic factor. All right, average annual temperatures. Are temperatures a living thing? Are they biotic or abiotic? Abiotic, right? Temperatures are not alive, okay? And nitrate concentration. Now, nitrates, do you know what those are? They're little nutrients, right? When you buy fertilizer, it actually contains a lot of nitrates. We're going to talk about them later. Now, nutrients are not alive, right? Living things need nutrients, but the nutrients themselves are not alive. So this is an abiotic factor. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about for today is just an introduction to really what the first part of this unit is about, and that's called ecology. Ology, that word, right? Biology is the study of life, because biology. Ecology is the study of ecosystems, right? It's the study of interactions of living organisms with each other and their physical environment. In other words, that's the study of ecosystems. So ecosystems are incredibly complex, right? There's a lot of interactions going on, and all of them are important to the overall stability of the ecosystem, okay? Every organism plays a role in supporting an ecosystem. There's very rarely an example of an organism in an ecosystem that is not crucial to the survival of that ecosystem, okay? We say that an ecosystem is in equilibrium when there are no drastic changes occurring in the ecosystem. So when things are kind of balanced, right? When there's not crazy jumps or drops in populations, and the ecosystem is kind of in a stable cycle at balance. That word equilibrium literally means balance, okay? And the biotic, abiotic factors exist in a balanced cycle. So we're going to talk about the transfer of energy and the recycling of matter. That is really, those two things are what keeps an ecosystem going. We'll see that later, okay? So how do we look at an ecosystem and say this is a very successful ecosystem or this one is okay, right? Now, all ecosystems are important. All ecosystems do support life, but you can definitely kind of look at them and say, okay, life is really thriving here, not so much here. So that's what this example at the top is about, right? Looking at like a rainforest, a lush rainforest with all kinds of critters everywhere, plants, lush, greenness, right? Insects everywhere. You can say, wow, life really likes it here, right? Life is doing very well here. Looking at a desert, there's life there, right? These little shrubs and stuff, but you can definitely tell that this environment doesn't support life as well as this one. So there are kind of two ways that we kind of define the success of an ecosystem. Now, the first is just by biomass, okay? Mass, remember from physics, just means how much of the stuff there is, right? So biomass is just the dry mass of all the living organisms. It's really just saying how much living stuff is there. Add up all the living stuff. So why does that mean the ecosystem is successful or a good place for life to thrive? Well, if it has a lot of biomass in there, it's got to have a lot of resources, right? It must have plentiful resources to support all of them. Going back to this, right? You can imagine if you weighed all of this grass and all of the trees and all the birds and all the everything, it would add up to a lot of mass, right? If you added up all these guys, it would add up quite a bit, but it wouldn't quite equal that rainforest one, right? Now we can also define it, and this is kind of a more realistic measure of what a successful ecosystem looks like, biodiversity. So that word diversity means like variety, a lot of different options for life. So biodiversity is just the variety of life in all of its forms. So that includes species diversity, having a whole bunch of different species, right? Genetic diversity, that means within a species, there's a lot of different genes at play, right? A lot of different traits. So like when you look at humans, we have a lot of genetic diversity, right? We have lots of different skin tones and hair colors and eye colors, lots of genetic diversity. If an ecosystem has a high biodiversity, what does that mean? It must be able to provide a habitat or a niche, which is just a role for many different types of organisms. It has something for everyone, right? It must have a lot of resources and can kind of cater to a whole bunch of different needs. So looking at this, right? How many different species do you see in this picture? I honestly only see one, right? I only see these little shrub things. Looking here, you see all the plants, all the birds, right? Of course, it's a cartoon picture, but it is kind of what the rainforest looks like, right? So we would say this is a very high biodiversity. This is a very low biodiversity. So that just goes to show that you can have an ecosystem with tons of life, but if it's all the same kind of life, that ecosystem actually probably isn't that successful, right? It actually might not be a great place for life. So that brings us back to our big ideas for the day. Hopefully you can pull these out, okay? What are abiotic factors? What are biotic factors? What is an organism, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere? What does it mean for an ecosystem to be in equilibrium? And how can the success of an ecosystem be measured? What is biodiversity? Okay, so if you're looking for practice with that stuff, try the topic 1 section of the practice assignment for this week.